Anthony Green has modelled the outcome of a double dissolution election using the results from the 2007 poll. And for more, Anthony Green joins us now from Sydney. And Anthony, your findings would not make for very reassuring reading for the Labor Party.
No, I mean, they indicate that the one concern the government's had and why it might have found a double dissolution attractive is that if an election held this year, the senators wouldn't take their place till July next year, which would leave the opposition and Senator Fielding able to block any government legislation. That made a double dissolution attractive for the government. But my analysis shows that the government would actually Labor Party would end up with less seats at a double dissolution based on the last election than they currently hold now. And even more remarkably, a repeat of the last election would leave the government struggling to get a majority at a joint sitting. And the joint sitting is the path which legislation puts the double dissolution is allowed to go through if the government still can't break the power of the Senate.
And it appears, based on your research, that the big winners from any double dissolution election from this point forward will be the Greens.
Yeah, the lower quota, which applies at a double dissolution, makes it harder for Labor to go from 5 to 6 senators in each state, and makes it easier for the Greens to beat the Labor Party in the race to that last spot in each state. Whereas at a half-Senate election, the higher quota sort of advantages Labor compared to the Greens. So at a double dissolution, Labor plus the Greens would gain control of the Senate, but at a double dissolution there would be more Greens and less Labor senators than there would be as a normal half-Senate election. And
your research also shows that one of the Labor Party's bête-noirs in the Senate, Steve Fielding, would more than likely lose his seat, but one of his Family First colleagues could get up in South Australia.
Yeah, the lower quota also opens up this possibility for micro-parties and minor parties to get elected. The election of a Family First candidate from South Australia is quite fine. It could have gone to the Liberal Party. It's a very narrow majority. But based on the last election, you get a climate change candidate up in New South Wales, because the lower quota, only about a little over 7%, means that the minor parties are able to swap preferences and corral them and get up and get ahead of one of the last major party candidates and get elected. It's harder for either of the major parties to get to 6 in any state at a double dissolution, but they can use their preferences to determine which of the minor parties get elected. There could be some relatively unknown players elected to the Senate if there's a double dissolution.
Now that the emissions trading scheme has been shelved until at least 2013, Anthony Green, what trigger would the government now be more likely to use if it wanted to push ahead with a double dissolution?
The legislation it can use is the health insurance rebate changes. That's met the double dissolution requirement. It's in the area of health. It's to do with saving money to spend on other purposes. The government could use that as a double dissolution trigger if it wanted. It wouldn't need a joint sitting to pass that legislation because the Greens support it, so it could probably get through after a normal half-Senate election anyway. But I think as the polls have dropped for the government, the double dissolution option is looking less attractive. When it was polling 54, 55, 56 two-party preferred, there was a possibility it would increase its standing in the Senate. If it's only equal to the coalition, then it would do badly at a double dissolution, would probably do better at a half-Senate election.
Just based on that, do you believe yesterday's news poll was, as many Labor Party people are hoping, a rogue poll?
Well, to see the Labor Party primary vote drop 8% and a vote for a generic other go up 5% is a very unusual poll result. And that's actually sort of interfered with the two-party preferred measure in the poll, because that's all based on past distribution preferences, and we've suddenly sort of got this huge surge in others which we can't explain. I think we'd have to wait and see more polls. I do think the government has polled less well this year. I think some of the polls we saw of the previous 2 years were far too high for Labor. I think the Labor Party sort of sat on its hands a bit at the end of last year as the coalition self-destructed over the Godwin Gretsch affair and then over their attitudes to climate change. So I think the government sort of coasted a little bit at the end of last year, and it's run into a sort of a heavier weather this year. It's still unusual, highly unusual for a government to lose after one term, but it's also unusual for a government to increase its majority at the end of its first term in office. So you'd have to say that some of the polls indicating the gloss has gone off the government certainly agree with history and are certainly now being consistently reported in several opinion polls.
And finally, Anthony, if the government did want to press ahead with a double dissolution based on any political reasoning, what's the timetable? What window has it got?
Double dissolutions can't be held in the last 6 months of a government's term. It can hold a double dissolution. It can dissolve the parliament for an election as late as the 10th of August, with an election as late as mid-September. Technically, they can go to mid-October, but that's highly unlikely. It requires an extended campaign. So July, August, first half of September are a possibility for double dissolution. They wouldn't hold an election before then because it would cause them to lose a year off their Senate terms and probably a year off their term in office. So you're looking at after the 1st of July for double dissolution. If he wants to have an election for half of the Senate, the Constitution prevents it holding that until the 7th of August. So you're looking, if it abandons a double dissolution, then August is the first chance for another election. If it doesn't want a double dissolution, he can hold on till October.